please continue to eat. I want to introduce our two speakers, Taylor Baldwin Kiland, who has written numerous other books, some of them for children. Would you hold that? Some of them for children. I made a copy of the covers of her books. It takes 4 pages. I mean, she's got books for children about everything from, drones to tanks to military GPS to Humvees to submarines to helicopters. I mean, where were all those books when I was a kid? I mean, all I had were these tiny little rubber soldiers. That's all I had. I didn't have books. I had to make up the stories. But she's got all kinds of books on all kinds of subjects. I think she has outdone herself with this one. This is a great book. She's a former naval officer, 5 years of naval service. Her grandfather was a naval officer, having served in World War I, World War II, and Korea. Her father was a naval officer, and she was a naval officer, so she knows what she's talking about. I also want to introduce to you, let me see what I just handed you.
Okay. There you go.
Also want to introduce to you Judy Silverstein Gray, who is the co-author of this book. She's a former correspondent for the Tampa Tribune, and she's published 5 books on military topics. And she's a retired Coast Guard Chief Petty Officer and 3rd generation of her family to serve in the Coast Guard. And watch out for her, because if you know Chief Petty Officers, it's like, it's like top sergeants in the Army. They can take your head off. And so watch out for Judy. But Judy, welcome. And she's with these 5 books, again, I think this is their top one. Folks, I made a copy of the notes, the endorsements that they have for other authors, because I thought, it'd be good to read an endorsement or 2. There are too many to read. They're from admirals, lieutenant generals, major generals, people that are in the know that say this is one of the finest books on this subject that they have read. As a matter of fact, you will recall we've had 2 POWs here from the Hanoi Hilton. We've had Bill Austin, who came twice, and Porter Halliburton, who came twice. Both times Porter came, he brought his wife, and his wife told me that of the books that have been written about POW wives and this operation that happened with how they unified a country around that issue, took an unknown issue and made it the talk of the land in a time before social media. Think about that. That is remarkable. I mean, frankly, you can be somewhat impressed if somebody gets on social media and it goes nationwide. But you really are impressed with somebody who did this before social media, and this is what they did. This is what this book is about, and you can do all your Christmas shopping over there. They're going to go after the talk, go over there, and I'll take my other papers back from you, and I will turn the mics over to them. And thank you very much, lady. I didn't introduce Candy. Candy Ellis is going to be introduced by them and is part of the program and was on the cover of the December 17th, 1970 Look magazine, and you will see a copy of that magazine here, and she will tell a little bit about why she was on the cover. She and her husband Bob now live in Davidson, North Carolina, and we're glad to have Candy here too. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that lovely introduction and for hosting us here in your wonderful city. You all seem to really like your cookies. When I checked into the hotel, they offered me a cookie. When we went to dinner last night, they offered us cookies for dessert. And I come here for lunch and they offered us cookies. So I knew I'd like it because they're one of my favorite desserts. Anyway, ours is a story about a small group of women in the 1960s who did what few women in the 1960s could. They bucked tradition, and in fighting for the men they loved, they actually changed foreign policy. It shares the narrative of a group of ladies who became what we like to call accidental activists during one of the most tumultuous times in our history. Amidst the din of the Vietnam War, the noise and confusion of the anti-war movement, civil rights marches, the Watergate scandal, this band of wives galvanized a president and a nation around the plight of their husbands. They were some 1,500 men held as prisoners of war or missing in action in Southeast Asia.
But this is more than a wives' tale. Unintentionally, this small cadre of women made the POWs and the MIAs so valuable that getting them home became the only victory for our nation. There were 58,000 war casualties during the Vietnam War, but bringing home a small group of men became the focus of peace negotiations. Every war produces prisoners, but only since the Vietnam War have prisoners become political hostages, so valuable that preventing them in future wars has become a strategic imperative, not for humanitarian reasons, but to prevent us from having to make compromises to get them back home.
The United States will still tolerate casualties in war, but we will no longer tolerate missing men or POWs. Our nation's increased use of unmanned technology helps void that threat. We now expend unlimited resources deploying special forces to rescue just one POW, whether that man or woman is in Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, or Bosnia.
So now let me take you back to the early to mid-1960s when our story begins. Lyndon Baines Johnson was our 36th president. His historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been passed, along with other voting and social reforms. But simultaneously, Southeast Asian and geopolitics were heating up. LBJ responded by escalating the war. Here in the United States, the median income was $6,600. The average price of a new car was just under $3,000. Fuel cost, wait for it, 31 cents per gallon. And a first-class postage stamp was 5 cents. This is interesting to me. 1 dozen eggs cost 53 cents. On TV, shows like Bonanza, Bewitched, Disney's Wonderful World of Color, Get Smart, and I Dream of Jeannie, and Hogan's Heroes were popular shows. Rock and roll was wending its way into the American consciousness and pop culture. Hit songs included Help by the Beatles, Crying in the Chapel by Elvis, and Petula Clark's Downtown, and also Where Did Our Love Go by the Supremes. Homes generally had one rotary phone.
Remember these?
And you could get it in any color you wanted as long as they were black or white. TVs often had rabbit ear antenna. Remember those? And families played board games such as Mousetrap, Monopoly, and Trouble. And communication was more personal back then. Bob alluded to this in his remarks. There were only 3 television stations, ABC, CBS, and NBC, And most of America sat down around the same time, either before or after dinner time, to hear the news. Vietnam was one of the first fully televised wars. It was actually the first. And much of the footage was raw and uncensored.
But what was life like for women in the 1960s? Well, here's a typical scene. Many still wore white gloves, believe it or not, when they went to lunches like this or got in the car to drive. They worked as teachers, nurses, or stewardesses, as they were called back then. They got married and they had children, and that was the source of their social status. Although the birth control pill was introduced in the early 1960s, many single women couldn't get it. Many doctors would not prescribe it to single women. And if a married woman asked for a birth control pill, many doctors would require them to get their husband's permission. Women really did not travel by themselves. I learned that from Candy. They did not work after getting married, and they certainly did not work after they had children, and many times they were fired from their jobs after being pregnant. That was perfectly legal back then. They could not get credit. They could not get a mortgage without a man's signature. No man, no mortgage. Military wives of this era, and how many military wives do we have in this audience? Yes. You had even more restrictions placed on you during this era. You were expected to assist and support your husband. Otherwise, there were repercussions for his career, right? You wore your husband's rank, right? The pecking order was just as formalized amongst the wives as it was the men. Many saw themselves as an extension of their husbands. They were expected to entertain, and a popular cookbook of the era was called The Cook is in the Parlor, which taught women of limited means, and most military wives were not rich, how to throw a dinner party without a maid. In other words, how to have your meal cooking in the kitchen while you are entertaining in the parlor. Each military service also introduced its own guide. This one is called The Navy Wife. It was updated in 1955, and the book painted a picture of an exciting and glamorous wife for a woman who was lucky enough to marry a naval officer. It painted a picture of international travel and interaction with diplomats and senior military officials and politicians, but it also issued a warning. Navy wives must get used to waiting. What is more, the book said, they must learn to wait patiently, for in such situations, and this is a quote, it is bad enough to feel tense and jittery, but it's worse to show it. Wives had to love the Navy as much as their husbands did. And until Vietnam, this culture permeated. Go ahead.
It's against this backdrop that men shipped off to Vietnam, a small country in Southeast Asia that was unfamiliar to most Americans. The conventional wisdom was that it couldn't take long for a country as powerful and mighty as the United States military was to defeat a country the size of Vietnam. LBJ's advisors advocated for an air war, and right on schedule, in March 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder was launched. That was a sustained aerial bombing of North Vietnam, and it would last for several years. Aircraft were being shot down by the North Vietnamese as aviators and airmen went missing. Many were captured. A black sedan, the harbinger of dreaded news, began showing up at the homes of aviators. Like a raven circling around base housing, it seemed to portend bad news. A senior officer and a chaplain would emerge from the sedan in dress uniforms. They would approach the home slowly, their military covers in hand, and solemnly deliver the news. We regret to inform you, your husband or son is missing. Families were stunned. Casualties were a fact of life in the military. Men were killed in combat, but missing? It seemed incomprehensible. The military had no structural support or policy in place for families, other than notification by a senior officer and hopefully a chaplain. One of the POW wives shared that the chaplain told her, "I'm here for you. I'm in my office Monday through Friday, 8 to 4.
And then, of course, there was the admonition to many of the military wives to keep quiet. It was a policy that told these women, in the event your husband is captured, every effort will be made to notify the next of kin personally. But the standard answer for all news agencies must be, Mrs. fill in the blank has no comment for the press at this time. The party line, of course, from the government was that prisoners were being treated well. And they were told this is only true if the next of kin abide by these rules. Name, rank, serial number, and age are all that they were told to give out, because any information they surmised could be used as propaganda for the North Vietnamese. Families, they said, are strongly urged not to intercede on behalf of the State Department, which is working diligently to secure their release.
After all, the North Vietnam had signed the 1949 Geneva Conventions. Those countries who signed the treaty had pledged to treat prisoners of war humanely, to give them adequate medical treatment, to feed and house them, and to allow third-party inspections of prison camps, or so they thought. Families had powers of attorney lasting mere months, the length of time for a planned Vietnam deployment, but many of those had expired. Government officials seemed plotting and often disinterested. They didn't communicate with the women very often. They didn't share information about other women and families in the same predicament. These women were isolated. Most suffered in silence. The government was confident they could achieve a quick release of the captive men through quiet back-channel diplomacy. Excuse me. After all, that tactic had worked during the Cold War, such as the shoot-down of Gary Powers, who flew a U-2 spy plane in 1962. His release 2 years later was considered a diplomatic triumph. But days turned into months and then years of silence. There was mostly silence from government officials, and the women waited patiently.
How would families cope emotionally and financially? And they wondered, were they wives or were they widows?
Fast forward to October 1968, when one woman decides to break the silence. We're now introducing you to Sybil Stockdale. Married for more than 2 decades, she's the mother of 4 boys and the wife of naval aviator Commander James Bond Stockdale. By October of 1968, he had been captive of the North Vietnamese for 3 years. She recognizes that Hanoi is winning the battle of propaganda in the media, and she has watched the anti-war activists claim that American captives are being treated well. But Sybil knows otherwise. With the help of intelligence officials, she and Jim have been exchanging encoded letters. She has been involved in covert operations. The secret messages he sends back reveal that the men are being tortured and placed in isolation for long periods of time. Sybil has also met with the State Department point man on the issue of the missing and captive Americans. His name is Averell Harriman, and she is unimpressed with him. He assures her that the government's efforts on behalf of her husband are extensive, but classified. In other words, she has received only a proverbial pat on the head. She doesn't believe Harriman. After 3 years of little progress, she refuses to keep quiet any longer. Bravely and boldly, she gives an interview to the San Diego Union. Where's the evidence, she writes, that Hanoi is a responsible government in the world community, she asks. And defiantly in that interview, she concluded, the North Vietnamese have shown me the only thing they respond to is world opinion. The world does not know of their negligences, and it should know, she exclaims. Syndicated around the country, many POW and MIA wives read this interview, and it gives them the courage to go public too.
Meet Candy Parrish Ellis, seated right here with her husband, who you recognize, Admiral Bob Ellis. She was the daughter and daughter-in-law of admirals, and she was barely 22 and the mother of a 3-week-old son, Hunter, when her husband, Lieutenant Chuck Parrish, went missing. And here's the telegram that she received in July of 1968. Missing. Military families whose husbands and fathers went to war expected casualties, but missing? How could the military not know where they are? As she said in a Family Weekly article in 1969, she says, Chuck is 6'1", 180 pounds, alert, resourceful, and full of life. People like that don't just disappear. And Candy, where was this picture?
This picture comes, of course they weren't drinking that champagne. They are on the carrier, okay, the USS America. And when Chuck got the telegram that Hunter was born. And that, with that miserable looking mustache, is my brother there. And then that's Chuck in the middle, and that's Bob Fant on Chuck's right. And Bob Fant is the radar intercept officer who was flying with my husband when their plane was shot down. And they are in their bunk room. And the gentleman above is Bill Beardsley, who is quite famous. He was a Blue Angel, and he's great fun to party with.
Candy also said in this article in the Family Weekly magazine, she said that first day that she got the news, I kept thinking they would hear from him, pick up a radio signal to home in on, and winch him to a helicopter in safety. It had happened before, and it could happen again, only it never did. And here's such a cute picture of Candy and a picture of her husband in the background and little Hunter. But like military families of the missing, Candy was told, you need to keep quiet. You really shouldn't tell anyone outside your family of your predicament. And as she told me many years ago, how do you live like that? How do you live like that? But Candy did have family support. She had, two admirals in the family. Her father was a senior naval aviator, and she knew the Navy. But even with all the information and resources she had, there was very little information about her husband, and even less information about other families in her predicament. Even if they lived a few miles away from her in Virginia Beach, she was not connected with them. But through word of mouth on the tennis court, at the commissary and the exchange, and through the Navy Wives Club, Candy learned of a small group of women in Virginia Beach who were meeting quietly on a monthly basis. They were a group of women whose husbands were also captive or missing. She and her friend Ryden, also 22 and also the mother of a toddler, attended this first meeting, and they were much younger than the rest of the women. They went to a dinner party for this sorority that, of course, no one wanted to join. And she walked in, and I will let her tell you about it, but it was a strange party, wasn't it, Candy?
Yes. Of course, this is a group that no one wants to belong to, first of all. And I have to preface this by saying that most of these women, all of these women actually, except for 3 of us, had been in this predicament for 3 years. 3 years longer than me. And I was much younger, Ryden was much younger, and it was a miserable first indoctrination because I remember sitting on the couch, we had no name tags, I couldn't remember anybody's name, and several of them looked like my mother, and it was just very, very awkward. There was no welcome aboard. No one asked you about your situation. And as far as I was concerned, they all drank too much. But as I grew older, I certainly understood that. And the fact that they were there in Virginia Beach, they were all attack aircraft wives. And we were 3 fighter wives that joined them. They were there for 3 years. I never knew that this group existed. And I mean, that just even floors me to this day. They were kept quiet enough. I mean, I seriously never knew. And there were at least 35 of us. And so it wasn't a good first meeting at all. And I just kept thinking, am I going to become like this? Mm-hmm. And it was very, very sobering because I didn't want to become like this. But I had to stop and think. They'd been there for 3 years before me. Now that's a long, long time as far as I was concerned. So.
But then you decided to give your first radio interview. You were encouraged by Louise Mulligan. Tell us about that first radio interview.
Louise Mulligan is still my absolute idol with the POW MIA movement. She was probably, I think age-wise, she was probably a year younger than my mother. Level-headed, I think she had at least 5 boys. She might have had 6. And that just, I mean, I lost count. There were so many. And she was just a marvel. She was full of lots of common sense. And Chuck had been missing about just a little over a year. And Louise called me and said, Candy, come and do a radio interview with me. Let's do it together. And I couldn't wait. I was just chomping at the bit to finally get out and do something because everything we believed, everything they had been doing, which was nothing, and everything the government had been doing, which we couldn't see, and we began to think was nothing, was not doing any good. So we needed to change things up a bit. And so Louise and I went into Norfolk and did our first radio broadcast there in Virginia. And it was very, very freeing. I think we were on that show for over an hour. And it was very comfortable. And from that point on, it was a little slow because we had some that, and rightfully so, who did not want to speak out. Some who knew their husbands were there, were POWs, and they were afraid, that they would be tortured if they spoke out. And when you think about it, I didn't have much to lose. I was really trying the whole time to get a name. I wanted a name out of there. So I was fighting for a list for POWs, and this is how we got started on the East Coast.
And that freed you to speak out
Oh,
and get out there, encouraged by your parents, correct?
Yes.
And she traveled in September 1969 with a group of 5 other POW and MIA wives to meet directly with the North Vietnamese diplomats in Paris. This is a time when women didn't travel alone. It was an unconventional move for a military wife, especially those who had been told and admonished to keep quiet and keep their burdens to themselves. Can you tell us a little bit about that trip, Candy, and what you hope to accomplish?
Yes, at that point we were trying to get this out in the open. And so we hoped, of course, to meet, the object was to meet with the North Vietnamese. There was one group who had gone just before us, 2 weeks before us, and they had gotten in, but it was very quiet. There wasn't a lot of press on this, and we hoped to by going, bring more attention to the fact that the North Vietnamese don't tell us who they've got. They don't let anyone in to inspect the prisons or see the men. Letters were extremely scarce. Some wives had three letters in 3 years. So it was to bring attention to it, and we were there in the hotel for 6 days before they called and said, meet us this afternoon, come for tea at the North Vietnamese embassy. It was really a house. It was very, very sparsely decorated, very. And there were four men in the room. Several of us had been shown photographs of people to look for if we got inside. And one particular man that we knew by a nickname was in there. And he was an interrogator of prisoners. Only one person in there did the speaking in English, but we could tell every one of them understood English. But only one person spoke to us in English. They spoke in Vietnamese to each other. And we were in there for several hours. I think we were in there about 4 hours. And they served us tea and candies, and we saw a movie on napalm and what we were doing to their country. They began, when we first got in, and Sybil said, Candy, you're first. So I went first, and I told them that I wanted information on my husband. I told them who he was, and I told them a bit about me. And one of the gentlemen said, I reminded him, the one that was speaking the English, said I reminded him of his sister who had just been killed by whose husband had just been killed by the Americans. And I said, oh, well, that's nice that I remind you of your sister. And you're kind of on the spot. It was it was a good meeting, and we came out of there not knowing what what we would know. We asked to hear, and they said we would hear. And of course, it went on for months and months and months, and we did not. But it brought publicity to the plight, to our plight. It made national news. People were learning that we all existed, and it focused more on the men, the prisoners, the care that they were getting, that sort of thing. That's what we wanted. It was care on, the focus on them and the list. We wanted to know who was missing. With us was Andrea Rander, and she's here, up there in the picture. And Andrea's husband was captured in the South, and then later taken up north. And she knew he was a prisoner. He was taken during the Tet Offensive in 1968.
But this was not the only daring thing that Candy did. She launched her own billboard campaign. So there she is, a picture of her hunters on the right, correct?
Yes.
Yes. She did a billboard campaign. She initiated a bumper sticker campaign, paid for them herself, and had them distributed all over the country. She went and met with Secretary of Defense Mel Laird. She went to Capitol Hill, where she hosted, try that one more time, where she hosted a national conference with Senator Bob Dole and Ross Perot at Constitution Hall, where she spoke before an assembled group of thousands. Thousands, there she is at the podium. And with the assistance of Ross Perot, she traveled to New York and met with the UN. And here's an audio clip of an interview she did at the UN.
Mrs. Parrish, too, is grateful for the efforts of the UN delegate who seeks information about our prisoners of war.
My husband is missing in action, has been missing in action since July of 1968.
When did you last hear from your husband?
I last heard from my husband before he was shot down. I received a letter 2 days after he was shot down, and that was his last letter that he wrote.
Secretary General Utah himself made a plea to North Vietnam to allow the Red Cross access to the American prisoners. The delegates' efforts, hopefully, will serve to ease the anguish of many families who still do not know whether their missing relatives are living or dead.
And she also met with the Teamsters in New York. Can you briefly tell us that story about the Teamsters?
Well, we were nervous. Ross Perot called and asked me and asked Kathy Plowman and asked another woman, Janie Schutte. And Janie Schutte's husband was a POW, a known POW, to go to New York and to do a media blitz or tour. And so we said yes. And this was in July of 1970. And we went to New York, and it looks like we've been doing a lot here with these slides. But we weren't. We were in our homes, you know, taking care of kids and doing all that. And we had these sporadic things that we tried to do. And then when Ross said, go to New York, I'm having someone meet you there. It was a gentleman by Tom Muir, who has a great book out, not about the POWs as much as his life. I mean, so exciting and such a great man. And we walked into, they opened the doors and we walked into this room. Flowers were on the table. Out the gigantic windows ahead at the Plaza Hotel was Central Park. We had our own rooms. It was a suite. We had our own rooms. I mean, you could have knocked us over with a feather. We couldn't even, I can't even tell you even now how blown away we were. We were not used to this kind of treatment. And Ross would give us what we were doing the next day, each night. And he would say the first day was magazines. We saw the magazine people. And we saw women's magazines. And then the next day we saw periodicals. We were there for 6 days. One day, then the third day, I believe, was NBC, ABC, and CBS News. We saw the news people. The fourth day, I can't even remember, but it was more of that, probably more magazines. And then the fifth day at night, we would talk to Ross every night. He would want to know what they said. And we would tell him what they said. Ross Perot not once ever told us what to say to them. Now that's pretty amazing in this day and age, in that day and age. He never once said, well, tell them this, or do that, or did you do that? Never. Just go and see him. That's all he wanted us to do. So the last day, and it's a good thing he didn't tell us before, was the Teamsters. Because I had been a stewardess in Chicago, and I full well knew what the Teamsters were. And the Teamsters were mafia to me. And I would have been very nervous about, and actually we were. So we walk there, we get there, and it's a tall brown brick building, no buildings on either side. And of course we're in heels and gloves and hats. And we walk up to the fourth floor, the top floor, and we saw George Meany, and he had two other gentlemen in there with him, standing on both sides of him. And they wanted to know, we gave them sort of our spiel about how many men there were over there and what our personal situations were. And he wanted to know, well, what can we do? What do you want us to do? And we just looked at him and said, we don't know what we want you to do. Maybe you can come up with something that you can do. And we had told him that Sweden had a diplomatic relations with North Vietnamese, with the North Vietnamese government. And so he was aware of that. And they were very nice, and we left. And that afternoon, he called up and said, I've got it. We know what we're going to do. We are not going to offload Volvos in New Jersey and Baltimore until they respond with a list or some activity. And so for 3 months, the Teamsters did not offload the Volvos in those ports. And the result of that was a telegram for me and a few others. I got a telegram from months later, but from Olof Palme, who was the Prime Minister of Sweden, saying that the North Vietnamese had told him that my husband was not in North Vietnam, was never captured there in North Vietnam. So that was the first official word I ever got. And like everything else, these words always came the day before Thanksgiving or the day before Christmas. They were very good at that. Yeah.
So it was a very effective campaign. And women like Candy became very, very effective media marketers. And we'll briefly tell you about one particularly important campaign, and that was the bracelet campaign, which was the brainchild of a college student who teamed up with the wives and launched this campaign that sold more than 5 million bracelets. And as a result, the fate of these men became personal.
So now you know that Candy and many of the POW and MIA wives have become international activists and media icons. And there are the bracelets with Alice Stratton. Candy also, are we going to shorten this?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Despite the notoriety that they were getting, Candy still had trouble getting a mortgage. Eager to purchase her first home, she had been carefully saving money and had enough for a down payment, but she headed directly to the VA to get permission. Puffing on a cigar, the brown-suited, heavy-set Veterans Administrator, who reminds Candy at the time of Chicago's Mayor Richard Daley.
This is what
Chicago
she thought he
theme
looked
here.
like, was this guy.
Tells her she's in a gray area. Candy isn't sure what he means. He takes a long puff on his cigar. Candy waits patiently. Then she asks for clarification. Leaning back in his chair, seemingly bored, he says, "You are not entitled to your widow benefits because you cannot prove to me that your husband is dead. And because you cannot prove to me that he's alive, you can't use your power of attorney I can't help you. But by that time, women had begun speaking out and even protesting all sorts of issues. How did the VA administrator make you feel, Candy, and what did you do about it?
He made me mad. And, I remember asking him, can you show me where that's written? And of course, he could not, and he did not. I went to him, I've got to say this, I went to him because I had been turned down on the lower levels to apply for this VA loan. And they just kept saying, no, you don't qualify, don't qualify. Well, people like Ross Perot had taught me, go straight to the top of the VA. And I went straight to him, and he just said there was nothing he could do. It was a great area. So you want to know what I did?
Tell them.
So I went straight to Congress. Went straight to Congress. And anybody with any common sense knew that this was just wrong. And so it took a while. It did not help me. My parents had to co-sign with me for my first house. But others behind me, about 9 months later, I think it happened. And it went through, and the senators were happy to take care of this. I mean, they were astounded themselves that this law wasn't somehow being enacted in this way. So it got handled, and I'm one of those people that my husband can attest to. Is when I see something wrong like that, you just don't. That's it. You fix it, and they were happy to help me.
So by 1972, a Harris poll concluded that 75% of Americans believed we should stay the course in Vietnam until all the POWs were released. The fate of those POWs and MIAs, who represented a tiny fraction of those lost in the Vietnam War, and an even smaller percentage of missing men from all previous wars, had become central to peace negotiations. They virtually eclipsed the fate of the thousands who were fighting the ground war and dying on the front lines. That's how influential the wives had become. And when the Paris Peace Accords were finally signed in January of 1973, signaling the end of hostilities, and 591 men were released from captivity, some after more than 8 years, their homecoming became a national celebration. Americans got up in the middle of the night to watch their release live on national television. And while most Vietnam veterans returned home to an ungrateful nation or were told to change into civilian clothes before they left the tarmac, these men returned to parades. They received keys to the city and lifetime passes to Major League Baseball, vacations, national media tours, and a celebrity-studded White House dinner. But there was no celebration for the families of the missing. They continued to live in limbo. Candy was convinced by 1970 that Chuck had been killed in action. The news from Swedish Ambassador Olof Palme, as she mentioned, had confirmed that. And a similar telegram from anti-war activist Cora Weiss convinced her that Chuck had perished when his plane was shot down. She was right, but she would not have an eyewitness account until the war ended, 4.5 years after his disappearance. It came at the war's end in 1973 when Chuck's radar intercept officer, Bob Fant, was released from captivity and confirmed Candy's suspicions. And what about the other men who'd gone missing? There were still more than 2,500 unaccounted for by the end of the war.
So one woman, that we will share with you, one woman has stayed the course, and her name is Ann Mills Griffiths, and she is an MIA sister whose brother disappeared somewhere over the skies of North Vietnam in 1966. She became and remains the figurehead of the National League of Families, which is the organization that Candy and many of the women started during the war. She's been leading the charge to account for all of America's missing since the Vietnam War. And along with other MIA families, she forced the U.S. government to form a permanent government organization, which is now called the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency. That agency, DPAA, has an annual budget of $130 million and 700 professionals who comb the globe year-round looking for remains from all wars. But Anne did not know what happened to her brother for more than 50 years until a fisherman snagged in his net a piece of his plane's canopy. And 20 dives later by the government, they uncovered a rib bone and confirmed that it was her brother's. And in 2019, she was able to bury her brother in Arlington more than 60 years after he perished. But her story is no longer unique. Often newspapers cover stories about a family whose husband, brother, grandfather, uncle, whose remains are repatriated 6, 7, even 8 decades later. I read one over Memorial Day about a family whose grandfather's remains were returned from Romania from World War II just this year. Families are stunned that their loved one has not been forgotten. But remember, prior to the Vietnam War, this did not happen. Our missing were just left missing.
So that iconic black and white POW MIA flag that flies above the White House, our Capitol, and every post office in the United States serves as a reminder of our national commitment to leave no man behind because of ladies like Candy. And we have this handful of gutsy women to thank for that, just like this one right here. They were resolute in their commitment, refusing to keep quiet because they were unwavering. Thank you so much for your interest.